The UFC has given us legends, champions, and icons who define combat sports. But for some fighters, the real battles began after the cage doors closed. From arrests and violent outbursts to crimes that shock the world, these are the stories of men who turned from celebrated athletes to fallen icons. Today, we'll look at 8 UFC fighters whose lives took a dark turn after retirement. And trust me, this is only part 1. Number 1. Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor, the king of combat sports, the man who made the fight game bigger than it had ever been, and the man who nearly burned it all down. From the streets of Dublin to UFC superstardom, McGregor became the first fighter in history to hold 2 UFC titles at the same time. He talked big, fought bigger, and made millions believe he was untouchable. But outside the octagon, the fight was different. The chaos was real. It all came crashing down in April 2018. On the eve of UFC 223, Conor McGregor stormed into Brooklyn's Barclays Center with nearly 20 men, driven by his bitter feud with Khabib Nurmagomedov. In a shocking scene captured on camera, McGregor launched a steel dolly through the window of the bus, carrying Khabib and several other fighters. The glass shattered violently, injuring multiple people, including Michael Chiesa and Ray Borg, forcing several fights to be canceled. The aftermath was pure fallout, arrests, lawsuits, and a media storm that turned the UFC's golden boy into its most infamous outlaw. And the storm never really stopped. In the years since, McGregor has been hit with assault allegations, bar fights, reckless driving charges, and public meltdowns that kept him in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. The man who once held UFC gold in both hands was now carrying a rap sheet almost as heavy. Number 2, War Machine. War Machine, a name that once struck fear in the hearts of opponents inside the cage. Born Jonathan Copenhaver, he was a relentless fighter known for his raw power, wild aggression, and never back down attitude. From his early days climbing the ranks of the UFC to his fierce battles in Bellator, War Machine was a brawler who captivated fans with every knockout and every war he waged. But the chaos wasn't just inside the octagon. Outside the cage, his life was spiraling out of control, a nightmare that would shock the fight community and forever change his legacy. In 2014, War Machine brutally assaulted his then-girlfriend Christy Mack and her friend, leaving Mack with broken bones, missing teeth, and life-threatening injuries. The attack sparked a nationwide manhunt, ending with his arrest in California after a week on the run. The aftermath was the end of his fighting career and his freedom. War Machine was convicted on 29 felony counts, including kidnapping and sexual assault, and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 36 years. From chasing belts to facing bars, his name now echoes not for his fighting spirit, but for the violent downfall that destroyed his world outside the cage. Number 3, BJ Penn. BJ Penn, a name once synonymous with greatness in MMA. Nicknamed the Prodigy, he was one of the most naturally gifted fighters the sport had ever seen. From becoming the first American to win the World Jiu-Jitsu Championship, to conquering the UFC and holding titles in both the lightweight and welterweight divisions, Penn's legacy was built on fearlessness, skill, and the ability to fight anyone, anywhere, at any time. But the glory wouldn't last forever. As his career faded, so did the discipline, and what followed was a spiral that shocked fans around the world. It started with bar fights in Hawaii, violent brawls caught on camera, one of which showed Penn knocked out cold on the street. Then came the DUI arrests, accusations of assault, and even a restraining order filed by his longtime partner, who claimed years of abuse and erratic behavior. As the incidents piled up, Penn's personal life became a public spectacle. Fans and media alike watched in disbelief as the once celebrated prodigy spiraled further, posting erratic social media messages, getting into heated confrontations, and turning what was once admiration into concern. Every headline, every viral clip, painted a darker picture of a fighter who had dominated the cage but was losing the battle within himself. This was the same man once celebrated as one of the greatest fighters to ever step into the cage, a prodigy who seemed destined for immortality. But under the harsh spotlight, the battles outside the cage became bigger than the ones inside. What began as glory and triumph slowly turned into a spiral of public struggles and personal demons, leaving fans and the fight world to wonder, how does a prodigy lose everything he once fought so hard to earn? Number 4. Thiago Silva. Thiago Silva. Once a feared striker inside the cage, a man whose power and aggression made opponents think twice before facing him, From his early days in the UFC to his battles in Brazil and beyond, Silva was a fighter who lived for every knockout, every war waged in the octagon. Fans admired his skill, but what unfolded outside the cage would forever shadow his legacy. The man once feared for his fist was now fighting a battle he couldn't win, his own life. Arrests for domestic violence, multiple accusations of assault, and explosive public outbursts began to dominate headlines, shifting attention away from his ferocious skill in the octagon to his chaotic personal life. The same raw aggression that once made opponents fear stepping into the cage now drove a trail of destructive decisions, bar fights, confrontations with law enforcement, and incidents that left fans stunned. After a string of controversies, the UFC finally cut ties. Suspensions piled up, fights were canceled, and the headlines stopped being about knockouts and victories. They became about arrests, accusations, and chaos. The roar of the crowd was replaced by public scandal, and the man who once sent shockwaves through the light heavyweight division was now battling a storm of his own making. From feared contender to public controversy, his legacy shifted from highlight reel knockouts to headlines of downfall, leaving fans to wonder how a warrior so ruthless in the octagon could be undone by his own demons. Number 5. Joe Son. Joe Son, a name that briefly lit up in the early days of the UFC, but would later become infamous for far darker reasons. Born Joseph's son, he was a competitor with a fierce, unpredictable style, a brawler who caught attention with every punch and submission attempt. From his early UFC fights to his brief notoriety in martial arts circles, Son seemed destined for recognition. But the battles outside the cage would soon outshine anything he achieved as a fighter. From stepping to the octagon at UFC 4 to a handful of fights beyond, Son never reached championship heights. His career faded fast, but outside the cage, his life was falling apart in ways the fight world couldn't ignore. In 2008, Joe's son was arrested for felony vandalism, but during that arrest, his DNA linked him to a brutal 1990 gang rape case. The details were horrific. A young woman had been kidnapped, assaulted, and tortured in an attack that left her with physical and emotional scars that would never fully heal. The revelation transformed Son's name from a forgotten fighter to a symbol of unspeakable violence, forever overshadowing any memory of his fighting career. The fallout was devastating. Son was convicted of torture and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even behind bars, the nightmare didn't end. In 2011, he murdered his cellmate in prison, sealing his legacy not as a fighter, but as one of the darkest figures ever associated with the sport. The man who once stepped into the cage with hopes of making a name for himself was now remembered not for victories, but for unspeakable crimes. Number 6. Mike Perry. Mike Perry, a name that exploded onto the MMA scene with raw power, unfiltered aggression, and in every fight feels like war style. Born Michael Perry, he quickly earned the nickname Platinum for his knockout-heavy, all-or-nothing approach inside the cage. From his early fights in regional promotions to high-profile bouts in the UFC, Perry captivated fans with his willingness to throw caution and fists to the wind. But outside the octagon, Perry's life became just as unpredictable as his fighting style, though far less glamorous. Off the ring, controversies, bar fights, and erratic behavior began to make headlines, shifting the spotlight from his violent knockouts to the storms brewing in his personal life. Incidents piled up. Run-ins with the law, public meltdowns on social media, and brushes with violence painted a portrait of a fighter struggling to control the same fire that made him feared in the cage. What was supposed to be a career defined by triumphs and highlight reel finishes slowly became overshadowed by turmoil and headlines that had nothing to do with fighting. Once feared for his power in the UFC and destined for championship glory, he's now remembered as much for his scandals as for his striking. Number 7. Rousimar Palhares. Rousimar Palhares, a name that once sent shivers through the MMA world, known for his iron grip and ruthless leg locks, but a legacy that would become as controversial as it was feared. Born in Brazil, Palhares climbed the ranks with a submission game so devastating it made opponents think twice about even stepping onto the mat. From early fights in Brazil to high-profile bouts in the UFC and World Series of Fighting, he was a competitor who demanded respect with every twist and torque of his limbs. Yet outside the spotlight, his behavior would soon eclipse his achievements inside the ring. Despite his immense talent, Palhares repeatedly crossed lines that no fighter should. He became infamous for holding submissions far too long, injuring opponents even after they had tapped, actions that led to suspensions, fines, and a reputation for recklessness, ultimately resulting in his release from the UFC. After his release, Palhares tried to rebuild his career in the World Series of Fighting, but old habits followed him. In 2015, during a welterweight title fight against Jake Shields, Palhares once again held a submission long after his opponents had tapped out. The result? Shields suffered significant knee damage, and Palhares faced immediate backlash from fans and officials alike. WSOF didn't hesitate. They stripped him of the title and handed down an indefinite suspension. The pattern was clear. Despite his world-class grappling skills, Palhares' inability to control his aggression outside the heat of competition continued to overshadow his career, keeping him on the wrong side of MMA history. Number 8. Jason Mayhem Miller. Jason Mayhem Miller, a name that once shone brightly in the early days of MMA. A fighter known for his flashy personality, unorthodox style, and ability to captivate fans. Born Jason Miller, he climbed the ranks with a mix of skill and charisma, appearing on shows like The Ultimate Fighter and earning a reputation as both a talented fighter and an unforgettable entertainer. Yet, what happened outside the fights would soon consume any acclaim he earned inside the ring. Miller's career promised stardom, but off-the-ring incidents increasingly dominated headlines. Arrests for assault, erratic behavior at public events, and run-ins with law enforcement painted a portrait of a man struggling to manage his own life. From bar brawls to domestic disputes, each incident chipped away at his reputation, diminishing the victories and talent that once made him a fan favorite. The consequences escalated over the years. In 2020, Miller was arrested on multiple charges, including attempted murder, stemming from an altercation that left a victim seriously injured. The arrest sent shockwaves through the MMA world, revealing that the same fierce intensity that fueled his success in the cage had spilled into a life of real-world violence. The man once poised for fame and respect was now remembered for the very real threat he had become beyond the fights. From champions to household names, we've seen how quickly glory can crumble. But these 8 fighters were only the beginning. Part 2 brings 9 even darker stories, where downfall turns deadly and warriors become villains. Don't miss what's coming next.